Imagine a time with one deadly epidemic after another, and the government's big idea isn't more police or even more doctors, but to ask regular citizens to go inspect their own neighbors' homes. Sounds kind of crazy, right? Well, this was the radical experiment of Imperial Russia's Sanitary Guardianships, and in this explainer, we're going to dig into why this fascinating, well-meaning idea was, well, maybe doomed from the start.
So this was the big question hanging over Russian cities in the late 19th century. You've got cholera and typhus just tearing through packed urban areas. And the government's usual playbook, just issuing orders from on high, it wasn't working. So how do you actually get people to change their most basic daily habits? Russia's answer was a really bold and pretty risky experiment.
And this was their solution, the Sanitary Guardianship. On paper, you have to admit, the idea was brilliant. Instead of some uniformed official knocking on your door, you'd have trusted local folks, shopkeepers, teachers, people from the community, trying to persuade their neighbors to be a little healthier. It was supposed to feel like neighbors helping neighbors, not the state policing its own people.
All right, here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the core idea itself. Then we'll get into a huge problem for historians, why these are basically ghost institutions. We'll see how they worked, or didn't, the conflicts they caused, some surprising successes, and then we'll deliver the final verdict.
So, what was the thinking here, really? The people in charge had this big realization. You can't just force your way to public health. You can't put a policeman in every single dirty courtyard. The goal was to create a totally new link in the public health chain, one built on trust and conversation, not just on rules and fines.
Now, you have to understand, these things didn't just pop up overnight as part of some grand government plan. They started really small, back in the 1860s, usually as these temporary emergency groups that only got called up when an epidemic was already raging. But the real game changer was that devastating cholera epidemic around 1907. That crisis was a massive wake-up call that forced officials all over the empire to finally take this idea seriously.
And what were they supposed to do? Well, their job description was huge. Guardians were meant to be the eyes and ears of public health on every single street. They were reporting new cases, inspecting living conditions, and maybe most importantly, just talking to people about hygiene. In some places, they did even more, basically becoming social workers who organized food and aid for the poorest families.
Okay, now we get to a huge problem for anyone trying to study this period, and it's a big focus for us here. For as important as these groups might have been, actually figuring out how many there were or what they really accomplished, it's incredibly difficult. In a lot of ways, they're a ghost institution.
And here's the bottom line. There's just no master list, no central database. All we're left with are these scattered local reports and a couple of conflicting surveys. It's like trying to put together a massive jigsaw puzzle when you know most of the pieces are missing right from the start.
Okay, let me show you what I mean. Take this number. A big survey from around the turn of the century found just 87 cities that had these active guardianships. 87. Got it? But then, just about a decade later, another major researcher looks into it, and he finds 113 of them. So, which is it? The records are all over the place, which makes getting a solid count practically impossible.
And this chart really shows you the scale of the problem. So look at that first survey again. Out of 680 total cities in European Russia at the time, they only even got responses from 258. And of those, only 87 said, yep, we have them. That means for more than 400 cities, the vast majority, it's a total black box. We just have no idea what was going on.
This lack of a central system didn't just create a data headache for future historians. It meant that on the ground, a guardianship in one city could look completely different from one in the next. There was absolutely no single blueprint.
You can pretty much sort them into two main types. On the one hand, you had the most common kind, which were basically emergency squads. These guys were only activated kind of like a volunteer fire department when a crisis was already happening. But then you had the much rarer model, the permanent committee. These were year-round professional groups doing systematic work, and you really only found them in cities that were serious about public health, like Odessa.
So, as you can imagine, this whole structure often put the Guardians in an absolutely impossible position. They were caught between suspicious citizens who didn't want them there and city officials who didn't really care. Literally caught between a rock and a hard place.
I mean, you can just feel the frustration in this report from Novgorod. Can you imagine trying to help and people are just mocking you to your face?
The Guardians weren't seen as helpful neighbors. They were seen as government spies meddling in private business. That kind of hostility just completely undermined any authority they might have hoped for.
And if they weren't getting stonewalled by the public, they were hitting a brick wall with the government. This report from Chelyabinsk is just devastating. The Guardians could go out, do all the hard work, find the problems, and propose solutions, but they had no actual power. Their ideas were just rejected or, as they put it, buried in special commissions, usually because the city didn't want to spend the money. But, and this is important, it wasn't all a story of failure. In a few key cities where all the pieces fell into place just right, this model didn't just work, it was a spectacular success. Odessa is really the poster child here. This is where the permanent, well-organized model showed what was possible. Their work was so effective that it helped put the city in the same league as the cleanest cities in Europe. For Imperial Russia at the time, that was a monumental achievement.
And this wasn't just talk. We have the data to prove it. Check out this chart. It shows what they found in just one district of Odessa. They identified over 2,500 specific violations. We're talking dirty apartments, filthy sidewalks, overflowing trash bins. They were making a real, tangible difference.
Orenburg was another bright spot, and what's so cool here is how they went way beyond just inspections. They set up canteens to give out safe, boiled water during cholera epidemics. They handed out food and clothes to the poor. They even tackled big environmental issues. They really became a force for both public health and social welfare.
So when we step back and look at the whole messy, complicated picture, what's the final verdict? What do we make of this bold experiment?
The reality is, for most cities, the system was just trapped in a vicious cycle. The Guardians had no real power, so officials could just ignore them. Because they were temporary, they couldn't build up trust with the public, which led to resistance. It was just this fatal mix of problems that basically crippled the whole idea before it could even get started in most places. And yet, you can't just write it all off as a total failure, because even with all those flaws, the Guardianships were a really vital first shot at something we still struggle with today, getting citizens directly involved in their own public health. It was a pioneering effort that proved the core idea, this idea of community participation, had real potential, even if the system itself was broken.
And that leaves us with one last thought. In our own time, an era of global pandemics, and, let's be honest, a lot of distrust in institutions, what can we learn from this century-old struggle? This attempt to build a bridge between the experts and the community. Because when you look at it, the challenges they faced feel remarkably and maybe a little uncomfortably familiar.